Welcome to the Minister's Message. Today I'm going to share a reading from Gospel of Mark, Mark chapter 5 verses 21 to 43. It's a longish story, but it's one that should be quite familiar to most of us. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about a concept that's I've struggled with over the years, trying to get my mind wrapped around the idea of the preferential option for the poor. So let's begin with the gospel reading. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." So Jesus went with them, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had. And she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling. She fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside, and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this they were overcome with amazement. Jesus strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. Herein is wisdom. Thanks be to God. So, as people of faith, we talk about vulnerability and authenticity, about powerlessness. There is a good vulnerability or powerlessness, and there's also an unhealthy or bad powerlessness or vulnerability. And so Jesus took on vulnerability willingly. That made him accessible, collaborative, enabled him to live in solidarity with the hurting. He shared power with others rather than exercise power over. So that's the good powerlessness, the vulnerability that we talk about as people of faith. The bad powerlessness, the feeling of being out of control of our lives, the idea that everything happens to us, that bad powerlessness that happens when there is power over the other. When someone has power over us, someone has taken power from us, or the power has been abused. So that's the kind that empire uses, the kind of power that we stand up against, the injustice. Right? So in our current crisis, the percentage of folks who could be called marginalized, our understanding of who is vulnerable, has expanded greatly. The extent to which some segments of our society are at risk has come to front of mind. Seniors in care facilities are close to the top of that list. Homeless folks, addicts, underemployed, all the people with names that describe their their empty half rather than their gifted full half. Developmentally handicapped, physically disabled, foreigners, and so on. Right now, folks with terrible debt to income ratios, even if they have high incomes, are very vulnerable when the paychecks stop coming. So we live in a world that favors people who embody success, beauty, power, wealth, fame. They get the best seats and the free pass much of the time. And they are identified and named by the full half of their glass. They tend to be treated pretty well by the world, while those with names that describe their supposed deficiencies live on the edges economically, politically, and socially. They almost always need advocates to help them be heard. There's a term called the preferential option for the poor, which I never really cared for, but understand and appreciate the concept, but now I think I'm starting to understand it at a deeper level. Richard Rohr really helped me with this when he said, it isn't an exclusive care or option for the poor, but makes them a priority in a world that normally ignores them or gives them the crumbs. It's like the good news as triage. The poor, the weakest, the vulnerable, the outcast in Scripture are not loved more by God than others, but they are recognized much more. But they recognize much more readily that they need help and accept God's love and care. And God's priority turns the world's priorities upside down. In this passage from Mark, Jesus turns the expectations of his culture upside down. Jairus is powerful, wealthy, influential, and has many friends. Of course, Jesus is going to drop everything and go to his daughter because this guy can help grease the wheels of his ministry. He's important. But then Jesus stops. He prioritizes the needs of someone who is helpless, marginalized, unclean, nobody, nameless, a woman who has suffered for 12 years. So what's a few more hours? But Jesus takes the time to heal her first. And in the meantime, Jairus' daughter dies. This would be unthinkable, a scandal. Yet this is the gospel message. The daughter is brought back to life. She's not forgotten. Jesus cares for her too. But the field is leveled by God's priority for those who need care the most, those whose full half of the glass needs to be recognized and celebrated. There are a lot of people who are hurting right now. This crisis has exposed just how vulnerable we all can be under certain circumstances. And so at this time, it can also help us to have the compassion for those who are even more at risk. We're not alone. We live in God's world and we have each other. Thanks be to God.